Yeah. So, good evening to all of you, and welcome to the second session of Roundabout. So, I've decided to call this Mystics and Heretics. We're going to be talking about Rumi, Khayyam, and the Persianate world today. Before I begin, I'd like to introduce my co-speaker today. Vaishnavi is my cousin, and she's currently a PhD student in the University of Bonn in Germany. She is a fellow Middle East enthusiast like myself, and she has very kindly agreed to do a part of this talk today. Before I proceed further, I just like to take you over a little bit of a technical glitch we had. This session is unlikely to end in 40 minutes, which is the time limit set on the Zoom free version. So what we have done is we have scheduled a second meeting. I believe most of you have received the meeting ID and password for that. So as soon as we hit the, say, around the 27, 28-minute mark, Vaishnavi will warn me, and then we will sort of end wherever we are, and we'll then move to the next meeting, and we will continue there. In the first part of this session, it's going to be mostly just the two of us talking, because we understand that not many people here are likely to have encountered Islamic culture that much. So in the second part, once we move to the new meeting, we would really love it if you guys would come in and give us your inputs as well. So that being said, there are a couple of warnings right at the beginning. Neither of us is an expert on the Middle East or even Persian culture, or for that matter, even these two poets. So there is plenty of chance that we might be wrong about a lot of things. If we are, we apologize right at the onset, and we would love to be corrected there. For the second is the Masnavi of Rumi is around 25,000 couplets long. And very obviously, we don't have the time to discuss all of them. So we have been very, very selective. I've selected from the first 500 itself. I myself have read only, say, the first 3,000 of them. So this is not representative of Rumi entirely. And similarly for Khayyam, there are many hundreds of rubais, and we've selected only a handful. So this is not entirely representative of them. This is not exhaustive, and whatever analysis we are doing, that also is not complete in itself. So just keep that in mind as we go ahead. All right. I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay, the PPT seems to be stuck. Yeah, right. So a little bit of the background before we get straight into the poems. So if you've seen the PDF, we have sort of given 6 questions that we said we're going to be asking of each of these poets. So the background to understand why we're asking these questions and where do these questions come from is in history. So in the 7th century, Iran was conquered by the Arabs/Muslims. And this brought Islam to a culture that had been in existence since 4000 BCE, that had been almost 5,000 years before the coming of Islam. And over the next few centuries, there was a gradual process by which more and more Iranians converted to Islam, and Islam entered Iranian culture. So people started writing about Islam, people started using Islamic figures in their writing, and so on. So this is the Islamization of Iran. At the same time, there was another process which was happening in parallel. Islam, which began with the Arabs, who were essentially nomadic people, did not have the same cultural sophistication as the people that it conquered, be it the Byzantine Empire or the Iranians. And so once the conquest had happened, Islam began to adopt a lot of these cultures as its own. And this is reflected in the literary styles and the language of the time. And this is what we would call the Iranianization of Islam. Now, another thing that the Islamic conquests did for Iran was it placed Iran at the heart of a great cultural exchange. The Arab Empire encompassed parts of what was once the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire. It bordered China and India and Central Asia as well. And all these traditions had to have an impact on Iranian culture, on the Islamic culture. Now, in the 10th century, the central powers in Baghdad, for different reasons, decided to shut the door on intellectual development in Baghdad and the central Islamic lands. But these philosophers and the scholars who had worked there now simply moved to a place which was more accommodating. And if we can, yeah. So this is where Baghdad is. And when they clamped down on learning, the scholars simply went east to the province of Khorasan in eastern Iran. This is the province where Khayyam and Rumi were born. Khayyam lived there his entire life. Rumi, of course, moved out later. And as science developed, as philosophy developed, there began to appear a gulf between the Quranic teaching and the rational sciences, as it were, that developed. And both of these poets were aware of this gulf and both tried differently to deal with it. And we shall look at how they dealt with this conflict between science and religion. Then, of course, there's also the fact that even before the Islamic conquest, Iran was a pretty divided society. They had several religions such as Jews, Christians, Manichaeans, Zoroastrians, all living there with different sects within each. And even after the conversion to Islam, these divisions continued to exist. They just found different ways of expression. So one of the chief divisions was that of the Islamic Orthodox belief, which said that the Quran and the Hadith had everything that was required, nothing more was required. Then there was the Sufi mystic orders, which believed that in addition to the Quran and the Hadith, there was also a lot of ritual and a lot of mysticism that went into understanding God. And then you had the skeptics who at times would outright deny the existence of God or would very grudgingly admit the existence of God, but then question a lot of the Quranic injunctions. Besides this, of course, there were other divisions, and we shall see how both Khayyam and Rumi were aware of these divisions and how they attempt to navigate this division. And finally, the 12th and the 13th centuries, which were the times when Rumi and Khayyam lived, was a time of great social upheaval. Khayyam lived in the immediate aftermath of the Seljuk invasion of the Islamic Empire and a new and renewed enforcement of very strict Islamic laws. One among them, the most unpopular among them, being the ban on alcohol. And Rumi lived during the almost apocalyptic Mongol invasion of the Arab Empire that saw the wholesale destruction of cities and the complete depopulation of entire regions. Khorasan, his birthplace, was one of the worst affected in this. And this created, or rather, this threw into focus a lot of social uh, tensions as well between the rich and the poor, between the orthodox and the unorthodox. And all of these tensions find expression in the works of both poets. So we shall be looking at how they deal with these tensions as well. So that's about the background. We will now move to the poems themselves. To save time, what we thought we would do was we'll first read out all the poems of Rumi, and then we'll do the same of Khayyam, and then sort of talk about individual points that we've mentioned here in each. So Vaishnavi, over to you.
Yes. Are you able to hear me? Am I audible to all of you? Yes. Or no? Am I audible? I'm not audible. Yes. Okay. So I'll be reading out all the verses of Rumi, and I hope all of you have a copy of it, the script of which was sent by Ananth to all of you. So we start from the lines starting from verse number 50. How many do not say the God willing, yet in their spirit they have the phrase spirit. With every drug and remedy they gave her, the pain increased and her condition worsened. The illness shrank the slave girl to a hair's breadth, the king's eyes a stream of bloody tears. By fate, the oxymel increased her bile, and the oil of almond desiccated her. The myrobalan caused her constipation, and water fed her fever like fuel. And then the next set of verses, starting from verse 225. The people who do not understand the secret of why it was Kezer cut that boy's throat. Whoever was what God reveals and answers. Whatever he commands is reason's essence. He who gives life is right though he take life. His hand is God's, he is his deputy. The next set of verses starting from verse number 265. It's why the world has gone astray entirely. Few know the representatives of God. They see themselves as equals of the prophets. They fantasize the saints are like themselves. They say, look here, we are human, they are human. Both they and we are bound to sleep and eat. And in their blindness, they are unaware. Between them, there's an endless separation. The wasp and the bee feed from the same food source. From one there comes the sting, from one comes honey. The fourth set of lines starting from verse 335. When craving comes, then virtue is concealed. 100 veils divide the heart and sight. A judge allows corruption in his heart. How can he tell the victim from the oppressor? The king was so cross-eyed from Jewish hatred that we cry out, "Oh mercy, Lord have mercy." He killed 100,000 innocents, saying, "I'm the bastion of Moses' faith." The last set of lines, starting from verse 400. When the light of dawn lifts up its head, and when the golden eagle soars to the heaven, like Ezraphil, the kindler of the dawn, he brings them all to form out of those regions. He re-embodies the exultant spirits. He makes each body pregnant once again. He strips the saddle from the soul's own steeds. This is the secret of sleep is death's brother. But so they will come back again by day. He ties a lengthy tether to their legs. Now over to Ananth, who will read the set of lines by Khayyam.
So the Rubai of Khayyam consists of 4-line poems, and we'll begin with Rubai number 13. Those, boy, who went before have laid in the dust of self-delusion. Go, drink wine and hear the truth from me. It was all hot air that they spoke. Uh, the Rubai number 34, which is what we will be using to discuss his views on God. The good and evil that are in man's heart, the joy and sorrow that are our fortune and destiny, do not impute them to the wheel of heaven, because in the light of reason, the wheel is 1,000 times more helpless than you. The Rubai number 53, with references to pre-Islamic Iranian characters. This is an old inn whose name is the world. It is the piebald rest house of day and night. It is the banquet of the leftovers of 100 Jamsheds, the grave, which is the bedchamber of 100 Bahrams. Rubai number 99 goes something like this. I know being and non-being's outward form. I know every exaltation and depression's inwardness. With all this knowledge, I may be ashamed to know any stage beyond drunkenness. So we now move to Rubai number 119. The season of roses, the brook's edge, the margins of the field, with 2 or 3 fresh houri-like girls, bring out the wine, bring out the wine because the drinkers of the morning drought disregard the mosque and are exempt from paradise. So Rubai number 145 reads, They call the Quran the ultimate word. They read it occasionally, but not all the time. A text stands round the inside of a cup. This they con at all times and in all places. So Rubai number 194 talks a little about social tensions, one of the few rare Rubais. If all man gets in 2 days is one loaf and a drop of cold water from a cracked pitcher, why should you serve those less than you are? Why should you serve those who are your equals? And finally, Rubai number 220. One Lord cogitates on the way of religion, another ponders the path of mystical certainty. But I fear one day the cry will go up, "O you fools, neither this nor that is the way." So these are the rubais of Khayyam. I'm sure there are already some very obvious differences, but now we'll sort of go point by point. We'll begin with the Islamization of Iran and look at how Rumi deals with it and how Khayyam deals with it. So Vaishnavi.
Yes. So regarding the Islamization of Iran, I want you guys to look at the line starting from verse 400. So here, right off the bat, you can observe that there are a few words which are given in italics. And those words are taken verbatim from the Quran directly in Arabic, and they're sort of placed in the middle of the other lines which are written in Persian. So this is one very obvious pointer towards how deeply Rumi and also Iran at that time was influenced by Islamic ideas and Islamic texts. And the second pointer is that you can see a character mentioned, Ezrafil. And Ezrafil is a character again from the Quran. And yeah, he is one of the archangels, and yeah, he blows the trumpet to summon the day of judgment, but we won't get into that. But the point is that he references these characters directly in his verses, and that is again a pointer towards how deeply Rumi was influenced by Islamic ideas and Islamic texts. But you can see that when you regard these lines as they are, when you imagine them in Persian, and to see that there are a few words in Arabic just thrown in there, uh, it could definitely be very off-putting. We see that Rumi doesn't care very much about this, so he doesn't care whether or not these Arabic words fit into the poetry and the meter in itself. So he just is concerned with conveying the fact that these words are taken directly from the Quran, so that they have their meaning is preserved, so to say. But now, since I mentioned the fact that they have these verses have words both in Persian and in Arabic, this brings us to the second point, which is the Iranianization of Islam, because he has chosen these few Arabic phrases from the Quran. One might as well ask, okay, why not write all the verses in Quran? Why does he choose Persian? So this points towards the Iranianization of Islam. Just as how the Iranian society was influenced by Islam, Islam also, so it was sort of a symbiotic relationship. So Islam also had a lot of takeaways from Iranian culture at that point of time. As Ananth mentioned earlier, uh, when Islam came to Iran, so it was the Arabs who brought Islam with them, and Islam hence was considered to be a religion of barbarians, because Iranian society at that time was culturally sophisticated, culturally much ahead of the incoming Arabs. So here you see two identities of Rumi playing out. One is his Muslim identity, and the other is his Iranian identity. So he tries to sort of find a middle ground between both of them. He tries to enmesh both of them in a harmonious way. So this attempt of his to bring in the very Iranian cultural finesse into this otherwise quote unquote barbaric religion can be seen in his choice of phrases here when he says um, he re-embodies the exultant spirits. He makes each body pregnant once again. So this choice of words is very soft and almost romantic in a sense, which was conspicuously absent from the Quran itself or from Islam. So here he tries again to find middle ground, but he is very careful with it. Even though he has subtly brought in this cultural sophistication to his words, he does not make an explicit reference to pre-Islamic Iranian practices or pre-Islamic Iranian culture. This also shows that he's trying to be diplomatic. He doesn't want these two identities to clash. So he's more interested in enmeshing them together rather than bring out very potential conflict between them. But as we'll see next, Khayyam had a very different take on these two identities, which would be explained by Anand.
No, so how does Khayyam view himself, as a Muslim and as an Iranian? We have ample examples of both. So if you look at the Rubai number 119, he basically, the first two lines is a description of heaven, where it's a garden. They've got four streams, one of water, one of wine, one of milk, and one of honey. Then there's also talk of the Huri-like girls, which are basically the 72 virgins that are promised. And there's talk of theory of resurrection as well, because he says, I'm exempt from paradise if I drink, which means he knows that within Islam, you're promised paradise after this life. And in Rubai number 145, he very bluntly says that they call the Quran the ultimate word, which is again, acknowledgement of the very central tenet of Islam, that the Quran is the supreme. What's important to note here is he sort of says they call the Quran the ultimate word. He doesn't say we call the Quran the ultimate word. But at the same time, he is not really making too much of an effort to deny the fact that, he accepts at least his Muslim identity. He doesn't try to completely do away with Islamic expression or completely do away with Islamic theories. So Khayyam is a Muslim, but he is a Muslim who is not very, very comfortable with his Islamic ideas. In part because, as we shall see a little later, his notions of God are more in line with the Greek philosophers, not as much with Islamic theology. So while he doesn't really deny his Muslim identity, he doesn't really make too much bones of the fact that he's not comfortable with it either. Now, the same can't be said for his Iranian identity. If we are to look at the Rubai number 53, he talks about two characters, Jamshid and Bahram. Now, both of them are pre-Islamic characters from a time when Iran was still pagan or at least Zoroastrian. And these two need not have been used at all. Khayyam could have very easily used the biblical figure of Solomon instead of Jamshid, and he would not have made too much of a difference to his poetry, but he still chooses to use Jamshid, not Solomon. Solomon, of course, is what would be accepted in the Quran. Jamshid, not that much. Now, if you were to look again at Rubai number 145, where the third line, it says, a text stands around the inside of a cup. Now here he is doing what he loves doing. It's usually have double meanings to what he writes. The first is a very direct reference to the fact that back in the 12th century, Iranian wine cups often had a line of poetry inscribed on the inside. This is simply him saying, well, everybody is Muslim, everybody says the Quran is the ultimate word, but more people drink wine than actually read the Quran. But there's also a second meaning here. Now, Jamshid, the same character that we spoke of in Rubai number 53, is said to have had a magical goblet, the inside of which was inscribed with spells. And by looking into this goblet, he could see everything that had happened in the past, everything that was happening at the present, and he could foretell the future. So this is Khayyam saying that, the spiritual quest for us today is still the same. We are trying to discern the meaning of what happened in the past. We are still trying to understand our world as it is in the present. And all of us would like to know what happens in the future. Why is it then that the Quran is the ultimate word and not our Iranian beliefs? What makes the Quran so much better than our Iranian beliefs? So this is him basically saying, Iranianism is just as important as Islam is. I'm an Iranian first and then a Muslim. Uh, Sort of moving away from the verses themselves, if you look at the style he chose to write in, the Rubais are basically a rebel's poetry. They do not conform to the more traditional Arabic and Arabic influenced Persian poetry, which is a monorhyme. That is to say, each line rhymes with the next. Very, very complicated in terms of imagery, and generally pretty long. They don't end quickly. The rubais are very short, just 4 lines long. They follow an unconventional rhyming scheme of A, B, A, which is the first line rhymes with the third and the fourth. They were meant to be remembered easily, and they're very, very direct. They don't use very complicated imagery. They get their meaning across in a very, very short way. The point was that the rubais were meant to be memorized and quoted as such. So this was done basically to escape the authorities. You could write rubais criticizing the king, you could write rubais criticizing the religion, and because it was mostly anonymous, if somebody tried to corner you on that, you could say, I just memorized this from somewhere. I did not write it myself. So, so
Oh,
this is the Iranianization of Islam in action. And as far as Khayyam goes, we don't see any of this attempt at reconciliation at all. Khayyam brings out that conflict very well, and he says, yes, there is a conflict, and I side with the Iranian identity. I don't accept the Islamic identity as prime. So before we continue, there seems to have been a little bit of a new development. Zoom seems to have given us an option of continuing without the 40-minute limit. So we will continue on the same meeting. I don't think we will be shifting. If, however, for whatever reason we have to shut down, then you already have the meeting code and the password for the next meeting. So yeah, we'll continue with foreign influences. Vaishnavi, over to you.
Zoom has suddenly been very kind to us. So thank you, whoever did this. Okay, we'll go to foreign influences now. For that, I want you to look at the verses starting from verse number 50. So this, you can see that there are a few characters at play here. You have the king who falls in love with a slave girl, buys her, and then the slave girl falls ill, so he appoints a group of physicians to cure her. And of course, again, red flag here, there is a lot of casual sexism and anti-Semitism at play in Khayyam's and in Rumi's work, for which we are not responsible. We just want to present the lines as they are and not sweep everything under the carpet, so that it will give you a right idea of what the poets themselves actually wrote in the first place. So yes, here the king falls in love with a slave girl, and she falls ill. And you see that in the last 4 lines, various remedies, medical remedies have been suggested. So here he says the oximal increase. So the physicians gave her oximal, but that increased her bile. Then they gave her the oil of almond and also myrobalan and water and so on. So these remedies, an interesting point to note is that they weren't endemic to Iran, nor were they endemic to Islam, which the Arabs brought with them. So where did these practices come from? So when, if you go back to the map of Iran, which Ananth presented, you see that Khorasan at that time was surrounded by very different cultures. So it had Anatolia on one side, it had China on the other side, it was also bordered by India. So all these places had very varied levels of advancement in various disciplines, be it science or be it medicine or whatever. And because Khorasan was so centrally located, it was very easy for these for the influences from these places to flow into Iranian society. Sorry. So one might think, yes. So here in the map you can see it at place. So Khorasan is very centrally located. So one might think that Rumi went out of his way to pursue and study up these medical practices, but it was not so. The way that he has mentioned it in these lines, so he has mentioned it in a very casual way, as if he assumes that the reader of these verses already knows all these medical practices. So that speaks for the fact that these practices were very commonplace in Iranian society, even though they weren't endemic to Iran. Uh, any common man, any average man at that time would have had the knowledge of these practices. And another uh, point to observe is that Rumi might also have been in the know-how of these practices because at that time religious places or mosques also functioned as hospitals. So the people who frequented mosques or who lived there, Rumi himself being a Sufi, would have definitely been in the know-how of all these practices because they would have seen them at play day in and day out since mosques doubled up as hospitals as well. This directly brings us to the next point of discussion, which is science and religion. Rather than being science versus religion, so we don't really see a conflict of these two here. Rather, we see that one encompasses the other. So here, first of all, uh, the mosques served as hospitals and not the other way around. And so now that we have science and religion on two different sides, what gains precedence for Rumi is also evident in the first three lines. So here he says that how many do not say the God willing, yet in their spirit they have the phrases spirit. So this, in the context of the story, it means that the physicians they tried all these, uh, giving all these medicines to the girl, but still it didn't work, and that was because they didn't remember or take God's name before before they gave her the medicines. So that this goes on to show that even though there were these two ideas of science and religion takes precedence, at least in Rumi's eyes, over science. And as long as you remember God's name, or as long as you revere that it is God who is the cause of all these happenings, then whatever medicine you administer would be effective. So in this sense, science and religion weren't in conflict. Rather, religion was of much greater importance, so much so that science became almost a part of religion. But this wasn't the uh, case in Khayyam's ideas. So that would uh, be elaborated by Anand.
So, regarding what Khayyam makes of the different foreign influences, it's less obvious here. We sort of have to do a little bit of scratching. So let's go to Rubai number 34, where he talks about the wheel of heaven and how it is more helpless than you are. So this is an indirect reference to the Aristotelian idea that God can only know universalities, he cannot know the particulars of things, which means God gave rise to everything, but he doesn't control everything. Now again, Rubai number 99 makes the same reference. He says being and non-being. So according to the philosophers like Khayyam, who argued that God exists outside the realm of being, outside the influence of space and time, and that he is a non-sentient being. So this talk about being and non-being is basically him saying, yes, this is the philosophical debates that are going on in the world. So in both cases, Khayyam is very, very well versed with Greek philosophy. It's very easy to sort of miss how familiar he is with it. But if you were to replace in Rubai number 99, the first line, instead of I know being and non-being's outward form, if it was simply I have studied Greek philosophy, the meaning would still remain the same. It doesn't change dramatically. But the fact that he's talking about being and non-being, a very specific aspect of Greek philosophy, suggests two things: that one, he was familiar with it, and two, that his audience, the intended audience, was also familiar with it. So, again, an indication of just how well read society could be in the 12th century. Even philosophies as abstract as Aristotelian philosophy was something that people were very, very familiar with. But what was Khayyam's views on science and religion? Again, he is very, very unapologetic about it, and he's very unambiguous about it. In the very first Rubai we have selected, Rubai number 13, he says, well, those who have gone before, they lay in a dust of delusion, and whatever they said was just hot air. So here he is taking a dig both at the orthodox authorities, uh, primarily because before his own time there were very few skeptics. Ibn Sina was among them, but prior to that there were very few. And he's also taking a dig at the Sufi authorities, because according to the Sufis, one cannot simply embark on the journey of discovering God. You need somebody who's already undertaken that journey to guide you. So this is him saying that, it doesn't matter who it is, both of them are lying, both of them are simply delusional. Moving to Rubai number 34, the next one, again, he says that, God is helpless. The wheel of heaven is helpless. It's more helpless than you are. Again, a direct opposition to the Quranic injunctions which say that God is an all-knowing, all-powerful figure. Khayyam says, no, he isn't. He doesn't have power over everything. Then Rubai number 99, again, I know every exaltation and depression's inwardness. This is a reference to the Sufi belief that there is more to joy and sadness than the simple experience of it. There is a divine aspect to it, and knowing that divine aspect is finally going to get you to God. So he says, yeah, I know both. I have read the skeptical philosophy of the Greeks. I know what the Sufis are saying. And knowing this much, I prefer to live a life of pleasure here and not really count on my afterlife. Again, another very important Quranic tenet. And finally, Rubai is number 145 and 220. Both of them sort of directly question the Quranic injunctions and the notion of God. 145 is an attack on the Quran itself, and 220 is this one of saying, well, Orthodox um, believe in God and their set of rules. The Sufis are all mystics, but both of them are wrong. So Khayyam was very much a skeptic. You could even call him an atheist, an accusation that was in fact made during his own lifetime. But he is quite unapologetic about it. He has absolutely no qualms at all about it. So this is about what Khayyam thought of science and religion. We'll now look at how Khayyam and Rumi deal with social and religious tensions. So Vaishnavi, back to you.
Yes. So regarding social and religious conflicts, we will focus on the remaining verses. So starting from verse 225, 265, and 335. So the first set of verses starting from verse 225. The first thing to notice is that again a Quranic character named Keza has been referenced, and what Rumi wants to convey here can be put in a little perspective if we know the background of Keza. So very briefly, Keza was a servant of God, so to say, and he traveled along with Moses. And Keza one day, as it is mentioned in the verse, he cuts a boy's throat, and Moses is horrified. Moses asks him, "Why did you do this? This is unlawful." And Keza says that he did this because he doesn't want the boy's parents to face the shame and the consequences of the boy's sin of being an infidel. So uh, he'd much rather kill the boy and pray that the parents get a child who is faithful to God rather than let the boy live. So, and here he also says in the next two lines that whatever God reveals and answers, whatever He commands is reason's essence. So, in a way, this is Rumi's way of saying that what Keza did was in fact justified, and any unlawful deed or any sin which is committed in the end, if it is if it is in the service of God, then it is lawful. So he's indirectly justifying extremism and murder in the name of religion. So here we see that Rumi's tone is a very marked departure from his usual tone of being the Sufi mystic who preaches harmony, who preaches diplomacy between various conflicting ideas. So here we see what matters to Rumi the most. The supremacy of God as mentioned in Islam and in Quran is of primary importance. So he's also ready to let go of his usual tone so as to adopt a defensive tone to uphold the supremacy of God, as is stated in Islam. So the religious conflict here is more the fact that he's letting go of his uh, mystic self to uphold the Quran in a way. Next, we go to verses starting from verse 265. Here he has, so in the previous set of verses, he adopted a sort of a defensive tone. Here he has a combative tone in his writing. So here he takes on directly the people in the establishment, like priests and mullahs and the order of the orthodoxy, who consider themselves servants of God. And he directly questions them that they don't have any right to call themselves as equals of prophets who are the actual representatives of God, as mentioned in the Quran. And he says that the mullahs cannot think that they're equal to prophets just because they have some superficial similarities like being human or the fact that both of them sleep and eat. And in the last two lines, he makes a very scathing observation and also a comparison. So he compares the wasp to a mullah and the bee to a prophet, that the wasp stings and the bee gives honey. So here again we see a conflict at play in the fact that he is taking on the established order who deal with Islam and Quran day in and day out in the society. He's taking them head on and saying that you actually don't have any right over the religion. It's the actual messengers of God that do. And in the last set of verses, starting from verse 335, we see social conflict at play here. So here we see that he has referenced very explicitly Jewish hatred, that there was an evil king who was so cross-eyed with Jewish hatred that he killed 100,000 innocents, saying, "I'm the bastion of Moses' faith." So we have to remember that at that point of time in Khorasan, Christians and Jews were religious minorities. But rather than being critical of both these religious minorities, it's only the Jews that Rumi singles out. So this is a uh, very obvious uh, aspect of anti-Semitism which is at play here, and it's not really clear whether Rumi was by choice an anti by choice hated Jews or whether he was forced to do so. Should also remember that Rumi lived in turbulent times. So it was the time of the Mongol invasion. It was also the time of the Crusades. So all this turbulence, in a way, forced the society to be biased towards uh, one section of religious minorities and be biased against another section. So here it's not clear whether it is his choice or whether he's forced to do that. But then we do see a social conflict at play here, and we see that there is a strain in Rumi's lines due to the society he lived in at that point of time, and this comes through in the form of very obvious anti-Semitism in these lines. And he also, as a closing remark, he not only is hateful towards Jews, he also makes a mockery of their belief. And in the last line, he says, saying, "I'm the bastion of Moses' faith." So he's almost questioning the authority of Jews to think, uh, he's questioning the authority of Jews, saying that you're not the bastion of Moses' faith, you've just stylized yourself as being so. So, yeah, this is again social conflict at play, but again, Khayyam had a very different way of expressing these religious and social conflicts, which Ananth will describe.
So, Khayyam was very, very sensitive to the different divisions that existed within his own society. One particular verse, not really quoted here, he talks about 270 sects being there in his hometown of Nisabur. Uh, but even in these verses, we can see the religious tension working its way into the poem. So, in the very first Rubai, number 13, he's making a very scathing attack on the religious orthodoxy and maybe even the Sufis, not very clear here. But in the Rubai number 119, there's absolutely no question of what he thinks of religion. So the first two lines, as I said, talk about heaven. And this is him saying, well, if the choice is between living, uh, pleasurable life or even a hedonistic life now and then being condemned to hell in afterlife that may or may not exist, I'd rather take pleasure now and condemnation later than settle for a life of austerity now with only the promise of a good life later. So this is him, uh, this is his own words. He says, cash in hand is better than 1,000 promissory notes. Now, the Rubai number 220 is again a very direct attack on the religious authorities. The first line, a lot cogitates the way of religion. This is him talking about the orthodox. The second, another ponders the path of mystical certainty. This is that of the Sufis, and he says both of them are wrong. A view that is reflected by the third group that formed uh, this one of society, which was the skeptics who questioned the existence of God itself. So here, very, very clearly, we see the lines drawn between all three sects of all three divisions of Islam. But that uh, here, I mean, it's not very obvious in the verses that we have selected, but there are a few other verses where he does make references to fire temples as well. So there was also tension between the Muslims and the non-Muslim population of Iran. But since Khayyam's emphasis was a lot on the Iranian identity, these interreligious conflicts take a somewhat backseat when compared to the intra-religious conflict, that between the Orthodox, the Sufis, and the skeptics. But what about social conflict? What about the class conflict, as it were? Now, Rubai number 194 is one of the very few rubais that directly deals with this. Khayyam was not a poet primarily. He was an astronomer, he was a physician, he was a philosopher, he was a mathematician, and he would often be called on by rulers to, as and when they fancy. So he was very dependent on rich and powerful patrons for his survival. And he lived in an age when rich and powerful patrons had a way of meeting very violent ends very suddenly. So he certainly would have had at least these few periods of poverty when he had either fallen foul of his patron or his patron had been replaced by somebody who did not consider him very valuable. So Khayyam does say this, that he says, why should somebody who has had so much learning, who has got so many skills, toil away for somebody who at best is their equal? uh, he considered many of the rulers as well as uneducated, very boorish people who did not have any of the finesse or the skills that he did. So this is him questioning the authority of the rich. He's saying, you don't have anything, but why is it that we should work for you? And we do that at a pittance. We just get one loaf of bread in 2 days and a drop of cold water. So this is kind of directly talking about social conflicts. So, as we've seen over the last couple of minutes, both Rumi and Khayyam faced a similar set of challenges, and both of them approached these challenges very differently. We hope that this session has sort of enabled you to understand the context for the poems of each. There is a lot of controversy, and we'll talk about this controversy after the discussion. So right now, I think I'll open up the session for discussions. You can either put them up on the chats, or you can unmute yourselves and ask us questions. Maybe if you've got thoughts on either of these two, you can unmute yourself and go ahead.
Also, if you guys found any particular set of lines interesting and if you want to discuss it further, we can also open up discussion for that.
So anyone at all, you can unmute yourselves, and if you've got something to say, we'd be more than welcome to. Yeah. Anybody having difficulties unmuting? Okay. Yeah. Just a few minutes. Okay, so Prerna is asking a question. Did Rumi and Khayyam live at the same time? No, they didn't. They lived about 100 years apart. So Khayyam lived sometime, I think, between 1019 and 1030. I'm not very sure of the numbers, but sorry, 1100 and something. This is the 12th century. Rumi lived about 100 years later, almost exactly 100 years later. So this 100 years apart, but we must remember that the medieval age was an age when development was pretty slow. There wouldn't have been very dramatic changes in society between Khayyam and Rumi. They would have had very similar society.
I have another question.
Yeah, sure.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So, did they, like, were they born in the same kind of families? As in, like, how was their, what strata of society were they born in? That would have surely affected, their beliefs, because as someone who's not very privileged in society, you are taught to, like, maintain status quo to survive, right? And along those lines, the strata.
The thing is that we really don't know. As far as Khayyam goes, we don't know exactly when he was born, exactly into what kind of a background he was born. A lot of his works were destroyed by the Mongol invasion. But what we do know is from his name particularly, the word Khayyam itself means tent maker, that he was probably the son of a tent maker. As far as Rumi goes, his father was a minor Qadi in the provincial town of Balkh. So in terms of socioeconomic status, both of them would not have been very, very far apart. But yes, Rumi would have had a far more religious education when compared to Khayyam. Khayyam would probably have had a slightly more secular education. In his entire life, Rumi spent in mosques and madrasas studying with Sufi saints. He didn't really study the secular arts that much. Khayyam, on the other hand, did. So we don't know too much about the strata of society in which they were born, but yeah, there were slight differences there. Okay. Culture around that time, history. Okay, so we've got a question from Shreya who's asking, is there any information available, the literature and history and culture around that time? Shreya, just hang on for a little while more. We will be giving you a few references at the end of this session. So Pranav's here asking a question. You said Khayyam was influenced by Greek philosophy. Can you elaborate on what Greek philosophy was at that time? All right. So the Greek philosophy was that basically of Plato and Aristotle. So Plato and Aristotle, with reference to God at least, held that God only knew the essence of things. He did not know the particulars. God only gave rise to things, but was not actively controlling them. So we go into something known as the Khayyam cosmological argument. This was an improvement on the Greek philosophy in the Arab world, which says that God is simply the unmoved mover, the first cause of everything. And once he set everything into motion, things happened on their own. He did not have control over that. So this is just one of the many philosophical aspects that came from Greece that Khayyam was familiar with. I'm not very uh, yes, it was a single God. There was never a question of polytheism, it was a single God. Now, mind you, when I say Greek philosophy, one must not confuse that with Greek mythology. Greek mythology did not pass into the age of Khayyam because the Greek philosophy passed first into the Roman Empire. And when the Roman Empire was became Christianized, the Christians adopted only those aspects of Greek philosophy that tied with their notion of a single God and Christ. So what came to the Islamic world came through the Christian world, and they would not. The Muslims certainly would not have known about the mythology of the Greeks. They would have known only the philosophy because that had already been sanitized by the Christians before them. I hope that answers your question. Yeah.
I want to add another thing. I think one of the people asked what was the Greek philosophy at that point of time. Here we should note how powerful Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle's ideas were in Greece, that they didn't need to be contemporaries of Khayyam or any other thinker who was deeply influenced by them at a later point of time. Because when you say Greek philosophy, so these three philosophers were like the pillars of Greek philosophy, and it was these ideas of theirs which underwent many transformations across various eras and across various geographical locations that it arrived in Iran. So obviously Plato and Aristotle were not contemporaries of Khayyam, but then you can see that their philosophy was all pervading at that point of time. So that is how Khayyam was deeply influenced by Plato's philosophy, even though Plato was not Khayyam's contemporary.
Yeah, and Ganesh was written here that he particularly likes the irony in the verse number 145. And uh, all of Khayyam's poems are like that. That is him highlighting irony. All right, and Bhargavi's got a question. Rumi was born into a staunch theological society, and also Arabic and Muslim influences was much lesser during Khayyam's time when Zoroastrian beliefs were still popular. But Rumi's poems changed subtly after his meeting with Shamsuddin of Tabriz. There are two explanations for why Rumi's poems are so much more orthodox than Khayyam's. For one, Khayyam lived, although the Seljuk invasion did happen, the Seljuks were also Muslim. And he lived at a time when only the Seljuks had just imposed a much harsher form of Islamic rule. A majority of the Eastern Iranians were sort of rebellious against that rule. On the other hand, Rumi lived at the time of the Mongol invasion. And for the Muslims who watched just how quickly an empire that they thought was invincible crumbled before them, the only logical explanation for that was God had decided to punish them for their sins. And so there was this all pervading had tendency within Islamic society at that time to see all of this as God's punishment, and therefore you had to return to orthodoxy. The kind of skepticism that Khayyam expressed in his lifetime would have been impossible 100 years later. The atmosphere would have been very, very hostile to such thing. On the other hand, the more traditional Arabic and Muslim learning would have been very, very encouraged. That is perhaps one reason why Rumi is so much more theological than Khayyam is. So Yash has got a question. Was Khayyam ever tried for corrupting the youth? I.e. was society overall more tolerant around his time? Society was a lot more tolerant around this time. That's not to say that people did not accuse Khayyam of apostasy, of being a hedonist, of being basically a very morally bankrupt person. One author in particular, Ghazali, wrote a very, very scathing attack on Khayyam, including a story where he says Khayyam goes to hell for his beliefs. But I mean, that was a time when it was difficult to censor anything. How do you control so many people? As I said, the rubais were meant to be memorized and passed on by word of mouth. So it was very difficult to really say that, he's corrupting youth, so somebody should do something about him. So yeah, these accusations did fly around, but they didn't really affect Khayyam very much. Okay, and Prerna has asked me.
We have a question from Pranav. So he says, that Khayyam, the word Khayyam means tent maker, but how was he able to access all this Greek philosophy and the education at that point of time? So
Uh,
that is because Iranian society at that point of time in general valued education very highly, right? So even though Khayyam didn't belong to a very privileged stratum of society, but the overall sophistication of Iranian society at that time made education accessible even to people who weren't that well privileged,
it's
right?
not just Iranian society as such, even Islam in the Quran itself, there's a lot of emphasis laid on education. They considered educating their children a great virtue. So it was almost an obligation for any ruler or any powerful person to establish schools, to establish madrasas, to establish colleges. These were considered a measure of how good a ruler was. So free education in the Islamic world is not at all unheard of. Even slaves would be very, very highly educated. Unfortunately, I mean, we don't have the time to discuss that. But if we were to go into education and how it worked in the Islamic world, we could go on and on and on. But yeah, education was a very easily accessible thing at that time. Anybody could get themselves educated if they wanted to.
Of course, it's a different question. It's a different aspect that Rumi received different sort. I mean, he received a more religious education, and Khayyam received a more secular education. But that is really going into the specifics. But overall, education was very accessible and a prized position at that point.
Okay, and Prerna is asking, when you say mysticism, what exactly are we talking about? So, in the Quran, for instance, it's very clear that there's no place for ritual. You know, there's no place for music, there's no place for dancing, there's no place for ritual worship. There are just very, very few. It is, and besides all this, everything else is sin. Now, what the Sufis were saying was very different. The Sufis were saying there is a place for music, there is a place for ritual. So, according to the Sufis, you couldn't really get to a stage where you would understand the spiritual wisdom contained in the Quran and the Hadith unless you had attained a degree of purity of mind. And the only way that purity of mind could be achieved was by participating in these kind of rituals. Music, dance, all of this was a spectrum within the mysticism of the Sufis. They said only when you do all this, you reach a stage of purity, and then you begin to understand the spiritual wisdom of the holy works. This is something that the Quran is a little ambiguous about. At times, you know, it's very contemptuous of this. It says none of these rituals are going to get you to God. Or others, it doesn't really say it's okay, but it makes some leeway for all this. So that is what we mean by mysticism. The emphasis being on ritual rather than entirely on theology alone. So, any other questions? All right, yeah. Okay, can you talk about what the Quran and the Hadith are? Okay, so the Quran is supposed to be the revelation of God. Think about it as the equal, say, the Bible of Islam. So the story goes that the Prophet Muhammad, when he was meditating in a cave, the archangel Jibrail, appeared to him in a trance and recited the whole of the Quran, or the instructions from God, as it were, into his ears, and he then went and told his followers that. So that is the Quran. The Quran is the revelations of God told to the Prophet. The Prophet Muhammad was incidentally illiterate, so he couldn't write. He told his followers, and his followers then wrote it down into a book called the Quran. Now, is the Quran just a collection of rules? Not really. It has got stories, it's got rules, it's got a lot of philosophy involved in it as well. But by and large, it is mostly rules. It talks about how a person should live their life. It even goes into the specifics of how much inheritance the son of a deceased man should get, and so on and so forth. But it isn't just a list of rules. It's a lot more than that. But what are the hadith? The hadith are collections of the saying of the Prophet Muhammad. Now, to set this aside from the Quran, you must remember that the Quran was what was revealed to the Prophet by the angels. The Hadith were not revealed to him by the angels. These were what he, in his own wisdom, came up with and said. It also contains some of the acts. So, what did the Prophet do? How did he conduct himself in different situations? So, in the Orthodox tradition, both the Quran and the Hadith form a single unified entity. They form what is known as the Sunnah, and the Sunnah forms the basis of the Sharia, which is the Islamic law. So, Quran is the revelations of God. Hadith is the doings and the sayings of the Prophet. I hope that answers your question. So, Wallab is asking, was Rumi aware of Amir Khusro? Uh, Wallab, Rumi lived at a slightly earlier period than Amir Khusro. Amir, and it's unlikely that they knew each other. Rumi lived slightly earlier than Khusro. Prerna is asking, is this the same guy as Gabriel? Yes. Jibrail in Arabic is Gabriel in English. When did Islam and Judaism, Christianity split and how? Look, they did not split. So Judaism came first, the Prophet Moses being the most revered of them. Then came Christianity. The Jews do not accept Jesus as a prophet. The Jews consider him as a false prophet. Now, the Christians accept Jesus not only as a prophet but as God himself. Then came the Prophet Muhammad, uh, almost 700 years after Christ, and he brought in more revelations. So the Muslims consider everybody, including Christ, a prophet. Mind you, they don't consider Christ as God, they consider him as prophet. And then you have the Prophet Muhammad. The Christians do not accept Muhammad as a prophet. The Muslims do. So it's not a split. Think about it as a succession. The first came the Jews, then the Christians, and then the Muslims. So I hope that answers your question.
And Gabriel is not the only character who has been taken from the Bible and incorporated even in Quran. So you have Isaac, you have Moses, you have all these characters who you also see in Quran, as Ananth said, it's a succession.
Okay, why do they not like each other? Well, that's a little bit of a, you know, tough question to answer, because one, the Jews consider the Christians as pretentious people who believe in a false god. The Christians consider Jews as ignorant people who are refusing to accept the word of God, which is Christ. And also they accuse the Jews of being the ones who killed Christ. So that's one reason they don't get along. And why do the Muslims have a problem with the Christians and the Jews? For the same reason. They believe that, you know, the Quran is the word of God, and if the Christians and Jews were really loyal or faithful to God, they would accept the Quran as revelation as well. Obviously, the Christians and the Jews don't do that. So there's one problem there. And why does everybody hate the Jews? This is a very, very difficult question to answer, mainly because there are so many factors that play into it. Entire books have been written about that. Perhaps one explanation is the Jews were very convenient scapegoats. They were relatively well-off members in society. They did not have a very strong national or even religious identity of their own. They prefer to live very quiet, obscure lives. And they did not have powerful rulers. They did not have big armies who could defend the population. They were very scattered across different lands. So they were very, very easy to target, very, very easy to attack and blame. That's one reason maybe that the Jews did not do very well in the medieval and even in the early modern period. But a difficult question to answer. There is really no one factor or one reason for why they did not get along. There are several. So any other questions? Or are we done? Okay, I think we've overshot even our extended time by about 10 minutes. It's been nice having you guys over. So I'm closing the Q&A sessions. You can contact us directly over WhatsApp maybe, or you can ask the organizers for the number. And if we have to have more discussions, we will. Before we leave, a couple of references since you asked. So where can you read more about the philosophy and the literature during this time? So this is a book by Albert Hourani. It's called A History of the Arab Peoples. It's a brief overview of the ideas that exist in the Arab world and the Islamic world, uh, with very little detail about the people as such. An excellent introduction to Islamic philosophy, Islamic literature, basically everything about the Islamic world. Then there is The History of the Arabs by Philip K. Hitti. This is a very old book. It's written in the 1930s. It's got a few factual errors, but again, goes very much into the specifics of everything, literally everything, from the conquests to the individual people and so on. So that's another book. Another good, this one about Khayyam and Rumi are the Penguin Classic publications of translations of their work. They've got a lot of introductory passages on the philosophy that inspired them and about the way they wrote and so on. And I believe Vaishnavi has got one reference for you guys that you might find very helpful.
Yes, if anyone is interested in the mysticism aspect of Islam or of Sufism, how exactly the verses of Rumi and also the other Sufi mystics translated into music and dance and various tenets of Sufi philosophy. So there is a book for that. It's called The Philosophy of Ecstasy, Rumi and the Sufi Tradition. Unfortunately, I don't have a hard copy of the book to show you guys, but I can always send the name of this book around. It's easily available online. I mean, that's how I read it, and it's a collection of articles from various experts and scholars in Sufi philosophy and Middle Eastern philosophy. So they have written various articles not only on Rumi's works, but also works of other Sufi mystics who preceded and succeeded Rumi, made a compare and contrast sort of thing, and they've also exactly explained how it translates into music and such. So yeah, it's a really good book if you want to get into the mysticism aspect of Islam.
All right, so that's all from us. There's this one question Ganesh had asked about where he can get hold of books, with a little bit of explanation. There are plenty in the market, and I'm sorry, at this point I'll be diverging a little. Uh, but the problem with both is there are a lot of mistranslations going around, particularly when it comes to Rumi. Uh, the translations that you're most likely to come across are by one particular American author who was more interested in sanitizing the philosophy of Rumi to something that would be more palatable to the American public. It doesn't really reflect his beliefs and his one as such. So yes, Coleman Barks was the name of the translator, and he went out of his way to ensure that Islam was completely removed from the works of Rumi. With Khayyam as well, one early translation, a very popular translation, is that by Edward Fitzgerald. Now, he doesn't try to alter the philosophy as much, but because he's tried to fit Khayyam's ideas into the English poetic aesthetic, some of the finer points are lost. So these two books that I've just showed you guys, these are the most easily accessible, more accurate translations. But there are plenty of books out there which will also be able to explain a little bit of all this. Maybe if I do come across them, I'll let you know. As such, I haven't looked for them. So that's about us. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope you've had.
Also, I want to add where to physically find books on these. So one great source is Blossoms. So Blossoms is the place where there's literally everything. So you guys can go over to Blossoms. If not Blossoms, due to various reasons, Corona happened and blah blah blah, then you can, if you know this website called Library Genesis. So Library Genesis is this seemingly illegal but not illegal Russian website where you can find all books in any language. So you can find books in English, in Russian, Turkish, and all that. So that is again a very good source if you want to find them online.
All right. So that's it from us. I hope you've enjoyed this session as much as we did. All of this has hopefully been recorded, and if somebody's missed it, we'll.
What's the website again?
I'll type
It's
it
a
out in YouTube.
slightly, yes, it's a longer name, but you can just Google Library Genesis and you'll get the website. So just Google for this.
Okay, so I think we'll call it a day now. So thank you, Vaishnavi, for joining us. I'll be putting up the videos once they're ready. All right, thank you all. Have a good day, and see you all in the next session.